After more than a decade of war fueled by foreign powers, the government of Syria has officially been overthrown, and the capital, Damascus, has been taken over by extremist rebels led by rebranded Al-Qaeda. This will have huge geopolitical repercussions. First of all, it is a major victory for the United States and Israel, which spent a decade supporting rebels in Syria, many of which were linked to Al-Qaeda and ISIS, spending billions of dollars arming and training these Al-Qaeda-linked rebels to try to overthrow the Syrian government, and they have succeeded. This is also a major blow to Iran, and it comes at a time when Israel, with U.S. support, is bombing and ethnically cleansing Gaza and committing genocide. It also comes at a time when Israel has invaded Lebanon and has killed much of the leadership of the Lebanese resistance group Hezbollah. And now Israel is actually taking territory inside Syria and potentially could go even further and try to occupy more Syrian territory. So this is also a major loss for Iran. Syria was a major ally of Iran, and Syria had provided support and weapons to resistance groups in the region, in Palestine and Lebanon. And now Syria has been taken over by foreign-backed extremists who have repeatedly said, as I'll document today, that they want relations with Israel. They made it very clear in interviews with the Israeli media that they want to have good relations with Israel. And that's one of the reasons that they were allowed to come to power. So this is a significant loss for Iran, and this actually makes the possibility of a U.S.-Israeli war against Iran even more likely. It's also a major loss for Russia, which had supported Syria, but Russia was not able to send a lot of military support to Syria because it is fighting against NATO in a proxy war in Ukraine. So it's a loss for Iran and Russia. It's also a major win for Turkey, a member of NATO and a Western ally. Turkey's always playing both sides against each other, but at the end of the day, Turkey usually ends up siding with the US and the West and Israel. Although the leader of Turkey, President Erdogan, will claim to support the Palestinians, he has not actually provided any material support to the Palestinian resistance. He has not sent a single bullet or any weapons, unlike Iran and Syria, which have been supporting Palestinian resistance groups. Turkey, in fact, has also allowed oil to continue to flow to Israel. Therefore, Turkey, a member of NATO, is helping Israel carry out genocide in Gaza, while the International Criminal Court has officially issued an arrest warrant for Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. So now that Syria's longtime leader Bashar al-Assad has been overthrown, who will the next leader of Syria be? Well, the country is still in chaos, but the leader of the extremist rebels who took over Syria is the former chief of Al-Qaeda. His name is Abu Muhammad al-Julani, and the Western media has spent years whitewashing this literal Al-Qaeda leader and claiming that he has distanced himself from his extremist past and is now supposedly a moderate. CNN published an insane article titled, "How Syria's Rebel Leader Went from Radical Jihadist to a Blazer-Wearing Revolutionary." And they also show how Julani has changed his image, and it looks like he's been working with PR firms in the West, or maybe with the Gulf monarchies, in Saudi Arabia or Qatar, which have been supporting these Salafi jihadist extremist rebels for years now. And they obviously told him to change his image. He actually dresses a lot like Zelensky in Ukraine, using this kind of green military garb, and he trimmed his beard a little bit. And now in his speeches, it's clear that he's been trained by public relations firms, because he's completely changed his rhetoric from just a few years ago, when literally he was the leader of Al-Qaeda in Syria. The Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria was previously called Jabhat al-Nusra, and it was the largest branch of Al-Qaeda in the world. And in 2017, it changed its name and rebranded, initially as Jabhat Fatah Sham, which is part of a larger coalition, and then it rebranded again as Hayat Tahrir Asham, HTS. And what's funny is when Al-Qaeda rebranded as HTS and claimed that it was no longer Al-Qaeda, Even the US Embassy in Syria released a statement making it clear that their position had not changed, that they still considered this to be a terrorist organization. The US Embassy in Syria wrote in 2017, quote, "The core of HTS is Nusra, a designated terrorist org. This designation applies regardless of what name it uses or what groups merge into it. HTS is a merger, and any group that merges into it becomes part of Al-Qaeda's Syrian network. We remain committed to bringing leading Al-Qaeda in Syria figures in HTS to justice," end quote. That was the US Embassy in Syria. And what's hilarious is that the US Embassy published a wanted poster saying, "Stop this terrorist," with the face of Mohammed al-Julani, who is now the de facto leader of Syria and who was able to take power in Syria thanks to support from the West, from Israel, from the Gulf monarchies, and from Turkey. The Western media's whitewashing of the Syrian al-Qaeda leader reminds me of an article that was published in the major British newspaper, The Independent, back in 1993, that had a big photo of the future leader of al-Qaeda in the entire world, Osama bin Laden. And the headline of the article was, quote, "Anti-Soviet warrior puts his army on the road to peace." And this article whitewashed Osama bin Laden, portraying him as a great anti-Soviet warrior who helped the West defeat the Soviet Union in the proxy war in Afghanistan in the 1980s, in which the CIA spent billions of dollars arming and training the original so-called moderate rebels, as the Western media called them, who were far-right Islamist extremists, fundamentalists, known as the Mujahideen. Well, Osama bin Laden was the leader of the Arab Mujahideen, who was attracting other extremists from around the world, who was using his wealth as a Saudi oligarch in order to fund this operation, this holy war against the Soviet Union in alliance with the CIA. And at that time, Osama bin Laden was an ally of the West in the US-led Cold War against the Soviet Union, just as today, rebranded Al-Qaeda in Syria is an ally of the West against the overthrown Syrian government of President Bashar al-Assad and his allies, which were Iran and Russia and resistance groups like Hezbollah. And this was actually admitted by the current U.S. National Security Advisor in the Biden administration, Jake Sullivan. Back in 2012, Jake Sullivan was the top aide to then U.S. Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. And in 2012, Jake Sullivan sent Hillary Clinton an email in which he stated, quote, "AQ is on our side in Syria." Of course, AQ is Al-Qaeda. So he was saying, quote, "Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria," end quote. Those are the words of the current U.S. National Security Advisor, one of the most powerful foreign policy officials in the U.S. government, in the Biden administration, who admitted that for a decade, the United States has been allied with Al-Qaeda in Syria, just as the U.S. was allied with the precursors of Al-Qaeda and the Taliban in Afghanistan in the 1980s. An article published in the Washington Post in 2015 admitted that the CIA had created this covert operation to arm and train so-called rebels in Syria, and that the CIA was spending nearly $1 billion per year. According to the Washington Post, CIA operations in Syria accounted for $1 out of every $15 in the CIA's budget, and this was the largest CIA covert operation since the CIA operation in Afghanistan in the 1980s that again gave birth to Al-Qaeda and the Taliban. The CIA program in Afghanistan was called Operation Cyclone, whereas the CIA program in Syria was called Operation Timber Sycamore. And just as the result of the CIA operation in Afghanistan in the 80s was the Taliban coming to power, and they're still in power today, the result of the CIA operation in Syria was rebranded Al-Qaeda coming to power in Syria. So the US has its hands all over this. And what is especially insidious is seeing how the Western media has been whitewashing rebranded Al-Qaeda in Syria for years now, helping Al-Qaeda to carry out this rebranding operation, which is purely a marketing operation. When they said we're no longer affiliated with Al-Qaeda, they still share the same extremist, fascist, Salafi jihadist ideology of Al-Qaeda. It was pure PR. We saw an example of this back in 2021 when the US state media outlet PBS published a softball interview with al-Julani, the leader, former leader, in scare quotes, former leader of Syrian Al-Qaeda. And he took off his traditional clothing and put on a Western suit. And this was the first time that a mainstream US media outlet had published an interview with the leader of Syrian Al-Qaeda. And there was an incredible moment in this report done by PBS Frontline in which they interviewed the former US diplomat James Jeffrey, who was the US Special Representative for Syria. And he, in this interview, he referred to rebranded Al-Qaeda as a, quote, asset, end quote, for the US strategy in Syria. So this is a top US official referring to Al-Qaeda as an asset being used by the United States. He admitted it openly. Meanwhile, while the Western media was whitewashing Syria and Al-Qaeda, helping them try to rebrand, they were ruling in the northern Syrian province of Idlib, bordering Turkey with the support of NATO member Turkey. And literally 3 days after PBS published that softball interview whitewashing al-Julani, there are reports that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, which Julani leads, rebranded Al-Qaeda, stoned 3 women to death in Idlib over accusations of adultery. So while the Western media was whitewashing rebranded Syrian Al-Qaeda, they were literally stoning women to death. This is the group that is now controlling the majority of Syria, excluding the east, which we'll talk about, which is militarily occupied by the United States. But most of Syria is governed by rebranded Al-Qaeda, which has been governing part of Syria for years now, the northern Idlib province. It was resorting to medieval-style extremist policies that it's now going to impose on major cities. And what this reminds me of is what happened in Libya in 2011 in North Africa. NATO led a war that destroyed the Libyan state, killing Libya's longtime leader, Muammar Gaddafi, and unleashing chaos. And still today, after more than 13 years, Libya has no central unified government. It's at a state of civil war, and there have been open-air slave markets. Some of the extremist Al-Qaeda-linked groups, Salafi jihadist fanatics, who were backed by NATO, backed by the US and France and Canada, they took over, these gangs took over parts of Libya, and they implemented some of these extremist medieval policies like HTS has done in Syria, and they created open-air slave markets, enslaving sub-Saharan African refugees. So NATO literally helped bring chattel slavery back to Africa in its so-called liberation of Libya. And here we are today, and we see the same rhetoric, whereas in 2011, the Western media and Western government said, we liberated Libya. The so-called dictator Muammar Gaddafi was overthrown. And meanwhile, life after Gaddafi has been exponentially worse, has been chaos and death and suffering and war. Meanwhile, Libya previously had the highest standard of living in the entire African continent. It had the highest rating of the Human Development Index. So unfortunately, I think what happened in Libya is very likely to be repeated now in Syria. And it breaks my heart to say this. I feel bad for the Syrian people, but we have to learn from history. Look what happened not only in 2011 in Libya, look what happened in Iraq in 2003. The US invaded in a war of aggression. They overthrew Iraq's leader, Saddam Hussein, saying, we liberated the people of Iraq from their dictator. And what happened? Well, the US-led war killed 1 million people in Iraq, devastating the country, destroying infrastructure, unleashing chaos. Still today, there are very high levels of violence in Iraq, and the US troops never left. After 2 decades, there are still US troops militarily occupying Iraq. And then, of course, it led to the rise of ISIS, along with the war in Syria. So the US, along with its allies like Israel and NATO member Turkey and the Gulf monarchies, they have been destabilizing this region for decades. Literally millions of people have died because of these US-led wars. And now in Syria, after a decade of war, it looks like there's going to be even more instability and violence. But US President Joe Biden is proud. And in a speech, he actually took credit for the overthrow of the Syrian government.
The upshot for all this is, for the first time ever, neither Russia nor Iran nor Hezbollah could defend this abhorrent regime in Syria. And this is a direct result of the blows that Ukraine, Israel have delivered upon their own self-defense with unflagging support of the United States. Over the past 4 years, my administration pursued a clear and principled policy towards Syria. First, we made clear from the start sanctions on Assad would remain in place unless he engaged seriously in a political process to end the civil war, as outlined by the UN Security Council resolution passed in 2015. But Assad refused, so we carried out a comprehensive sanction program against him and all those responsible for atrocities against the Syrian people. Second, we maintained our military presence in Syria. Third, we've supported Israel's freedom of action against Iranian networks in Syria and against actors aligned with Iran who transported lethal aid to Lebanon. And when necessary, ordered the use of military force against Iranian networks to protect U.S. forces. Our approach has shifted the balance of power in the Middle East.
So this is one of the major reasons that these extremist al-Qaeda-linked rebels were able to take over so much Syrian territory so quickly, because they had gotten tons of weapons from the U.S. and from its allies. In fact, back in 2015, the U.S. military publicly admitted that some of the weapons that it gave to the so-called moderate rebels were immediately given to al-Qaeda. And it's not just the U.S. Turkey also played a major role in supporting these extremist rebels. This was reported by the French media outlet AFP and the Israeli media outlet The Times of Israel. Opposition sources in Syria admitted that Turkish intelligence was helping them carry out this operation, and that Turkey itself, Erdogan, gave his green light to carry out this offensive to overthrow the Syrian government. Another country that was reportedly helping these al-Qaeda-linked rebels in Syria was Ukraine. This was reported in several Western media outlets because these extremist al-Qaeda-linked rebels in Syria were using suicide drones, kamikaze drones, and Syrian opposition figures told several media outlets that they were actually collaborating with Ukrainian intelligence, which was helping them coordinate to carry out this war. And Ukraine was also sharing some of this kamikaze drone technology that these al-Qaeda-linked rebels were using to attack the Syrian army. And of course, Israel also played an important role in helping to overthrow the Syrian government. In fact, when these al-Qaeda-linked rebels took over Damascus, the Israeli prime minister and wanted war criminal Benjamin Netanyahu, he visited the border with Syria for a photo op, and he published a speech in which he took credit for the overthrow of the Syrian government. Netanyahu boasted that the fall of Assad was, quote, a direct result of the blows we have inflicted on Iran and Hezbollah, the main supporters of the Assad regime, end quote. Here's that clip of Netanyahu.
This collapse is a direct result of our forceful action against Hezbollah and Iran, Assad's main supporters. It set off a chain reaction of all those who want to free themselves from this tyranny and its oppression.
Israel had been supporting these Syrian al-Qaeda-linked rebels for years. Back in 2019, the chief of the IDF admitted that Israel had been giving weapons to these so-called rebels in Syria. The major Israeli media outlet, the Jerusalem Post, published an article admitting that Israel had been treating Syrian al-Qaeda members in Israeli hospitals. So members of al-Qaeda in Syria would cross over to Israel. Israel would treat them in its hospitals and then send them back into Syria to try to overthrow the Syrian government. Well, now they've succeeded, and Syrian rebranded al-Qaeda is in power in Syria in no small part thanks to the support it got from Israel. The US media has openly boasted that Israel helped to overthrow the Syrian government. The neoconservative New York Times columnist Bret Stephens, who has enthusiastically supported every single US war. He's a complete hawk. He loved the war in Iraq. And he published a column at the New York Times titled, "Syrians also have Israel to thank for their liberation," end quote. So they're not even hiding it. And this December, the Times of Israel published several different articles that feature interviews with members of the Al-Qaeda-linked Syrian opposition who said that they love Israel. I'm not exaggerating. One of these Syrian rebels said, quote, "We love Israel and we were never its enemies. We don't hate you. We love you very much," end quote. They're saying that as Israel is carrying out genocide in Gaza and ethnic cleansing and killing tens of thousands of Palestinian children. This is what the Syrian opposition says, because they were backed by Israel. And now Israel is taking advantage of the situation and trying to seize more territory inside Syria. Immediately after rebranded Al-Qaeda took power in Damascus, Israel sent troops into the buffer zone surrounding the illegally occupied Golan Heights. Now, according to international law, Golan Heights is part of Syrian territory, but Israel has illegally occupied it since 1967. And in 1974, there was an agreement reached on a buffer zone, and Israel did not enter that buffer zone for 50 years. The Syrian government prevented Israel from taking more territory. But as soon as rebranded Al-Qaeda took over in Syria, Israel went into the buffer zone, seizing more Syrian territory. And now many people suspect that Israel may try to colonize even more Syrian land, just as Israel has tried to colonize southern Lebanon. So there's no way around it. It has to be said that this is a huge blow to the axis of resistance in the Middle East, in West Asia. This is a major blow that has done severe damage to these resistance groups fighting against Israeli colonialism, because Syria had been a major support of weapons to resistance groups in Lebanon, including to Hezbollah, resistance groups in Palestine, and also it was a land bridge. Physically, it was a land bridge from Iran into Iraq, into Syria, into Lebanon, and then into Palestine. And now, by removing Syria from the heart of the resistance axis, this is going to be very damaging. It's not the end of the resistance axis. Israel wants people to believe that. They have done damage to these groups. They've killed the leadership of Hezbollah. They've done a lot of damage to Hamas. They've helped to overthrow the Syrian government. But there still are many resistance groups. Iran is still going to continue to support resistance against Israeli colonialism and U.S. imperialism. In Iraq, there are resistance groups. Hezbollah in Lebanon has not been defeated. Some of its leaders have been killed, but it still remains intact and has been able to successfully fight against the Israeli colonial occupiers trying to colonize more Lebanese territory. Also in Yemen, the resistance Ansar Allah, known as the Houthis, but the official name is Ansar Allah, they are still the de facto government in northern Yemen, in the capital Sana'a, and they have continued providing support to the Palestinian people. So the axis of resistance is not entirely defeated, but this is a major setback. It is a significant blow to the resistance. The U.S. and Israel have not conclusively won the war, but they have decisively won a strategic battle.